Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and it's time for Kobolds and Catacombs card reviews. That's right, the new expansion was just revealed. It's called Kobolds and Catacombs. It's all about, believe it or not, Kobolds and Catacombs, treasures, all kinds of fun new mechanics and adventures, it sounds like. And I have 8 new cards to talk about today. There were 14 total cards revealed on day 1 of BlizzCon. I'll be covering the remaining cards in part 2, so stay tuned for that before too long. But for now, here's how this is going to work as my card reviews have worked in the past. Up first, I'm going to talk about the new cards in detail, giving you my thoughts on how these cards are going to work and how good they might be based on my understanding of Hearthstone and how it's operated in the past. But I'm also going to be doing some really quick fire reviews where I run through each card and rate them from 1 to 5 stars on just how impactful and influential and powerful I think these cards are going to be. If you just want to see the cards and see the reveals and see the quick reviews, there is a link in the description below with a shortcut to those quick reviews. I encourage you to take that link to go see the cards as quick as you can. But if you want to spend some time with me talking about these cards in more detail, that's what we're going to do right now. So let's go ahead and jump into the detailed reviews of some fantastic and cool and amazing new Kobolds and Catacombs cards. Up first, we have Marin the Fox. This was the promotional card revealed before BlizzCon. We all knew Marin the Fox was coming. We didn't know exactly what he was going to be like, but he has now been fully revealed. And although he is going to be available before the expansion releases, and in fact, just a few days after BlizzCon, we're all going to get to play with this guy. He's coming to every collection for free, whether you bought the virtual ticket or not, and you'll get him in golden if you bought the BlizzCon virtual ticket. But despite the fact that he's coming early, he is still a Kobolds and Catacombs card. You can tell that by the silhouette artwork behind his text there. You'll see the candle that is the icon for the new expansion. But anyway, Marin the Fox, new legendary minion, 8-mana card, 6/6 in stats with a really interesting battle cry. Summon a 0/8 treasure chest for your opponent, and then break it for awesome loot. So you're going to be summoning a 0/8 minion across the board, and then you're going to have to kill that minion. Essentially, it's going to have a death rattle that says, give the opponent some awesome loot. And what that means is you're going to get one of 4 random treasures, some loot. A card essentially is going to be added to your hand when you successfully kill that 0/8 minion. And these are the 4 cards that you can get. And frankly, they're all totally busted. They're completely broken. They're all 3 mana. Up first is Toland's Goblet. This one allows you to draw a card and then fill your hand with copies of that card. So if you had 2 cards in hand, this could basically give you 8 copies of a Tyrian Forging, and you could just play Tyrian Forging every single turn. It could give you 8 copies of Elise the Trailblazer, and you could add a new Elise pack to your deck every single turn for basically infinite cards, right? There's all kinds of crazy stuff you could do with Toland's Goblet. You might also just get 8 backstabs, and hey, that might not be bad, right? They can do a lot of work over time because they're free spells, and that's a big tempo gain. So a lot of potential with Toland's Goblet. Clearly a hand advantage, resource advantage, value kind of card. You also have a card like Xerox Crown there in the top right. This one allows you to discover a legendary minion and then summon 2 copies of that minion to the board immediately. And that can also be absolutely insane. You could just summon 2 Tyrians right away. And there's a good chance any given time you play this, you're probably going to get at least one pretty big, solidly statted legendary. You might not always get something with a great onboard effect, the Malagos, the Tyrian style cards with big death rattles or big effects. So sometimes this will just be a stat value kind of play where you just dump a ton of junk onto the board at once. It won't necessarily give you anything extra, but still, just summoning a couple 8/8 Alexstraszas for 3 mana is a huge tempo advantage. So lot to do with Xerox Crown when it works. There are going to be other times you do get the Lorewalker Cho Nat Pagle trio, and it's not quite as exciting. But those are going to be few and far between. Most of the time, you're going to have something to work with, and then occasionally it's just going to be something totally insane, right? The super high roll kinds of things, where you're at 1 health and you get double Ragnaros Light Lord, and you heal for 16, and you summon 16 in stats, all for 3 mana, and that's absurd. Moving on to the next card, we have the Golden Kobold. This is a 3 mana 6/6 taunt, a lot like the Golden Monkey, if you might remember that card from League of Explorers. This time, though, it only replaces your hand with legendary minions when you play it. It does not replace your hand and your deck, but still a very interesting card because, frankly, a 3 mana 6/6 taunt, fantastic in its own right. That is an incredibly playable card. But then you also get this upside of turning some leftover junk in your hand into legendary minions. So in a late game scenario, that can create a lot of additional value and extra resources and powerful swings to work with. So that's really powerful. And of course, the case with this one, as with all of these, is you do get to decide when to play these. So although, of course, there could be some downsides turning resources into legendary minions, you can wait until a time where you just have junk left in your hand and play the Golden Kobold. With Toland's Goblet, you can try to draw through some crap in your deck before you play Toland's to make sure it hits something better. You can make decisions based on this. You can empty your hand before you play Toland's Goblet, etc. So there's a lot of power in that. And then finally, the fourth card here is the Wondrous Wand. And this one allows you to draw 3 cards and reduce their cost to 0. That's also really fantastic, high-tempo kind of play. This is the one that people are going to sleep on because it looks kind of the least exciting of all of these. The other ones involve legendary minions and kind of crazy outcomes and a lot of RNG. But this one might actually be one of the better ones just because it's so consistently good. Cards in your deck are often better than random cards just because you know they synergize with your plan and they do things you want them to do. And being able to play cards in your deck for 0 mana, of course, is really, really strong. You can make all kinds of absurd plays. Imagine that, for instance, in like a Highlander Priest, where now you have even more cards to combo off of with your hero power, and you can start to see just how valuable that becomes. But really, any kind of card, whether it be minions or spells, if their cost is reduced to 0, it's going to make them very, very powerful. So clearly, all 4 of these have outstanding effects, incredibly ridiculous results. They can do absurd things, win you the game outright every single time. But the question is, are they any good when you have to summon this treasure chest and kill it, and you have to spend 8 mana for that opportunity? And that's where things start to look a little shakier for me. So first things first, Marin the Fox does technically summon an opponent for your minion. That's not ideal in all kinds of decks. There are decks out there that have ways to buff minions. Imagine summoning a 0/8 for a token druid, for instance, and they cast Mark of the Lotus, etc., etc. Now they have a giant thing, and a Savagor body, and a Bloodlust body. So that's risk number 1. Risk number 2 is that Marin the Fox is not really affecting the game immediately. It's taking a really long time for this value to add back up. So, compare this to something like Tyrion. I know I've said Tyrion like 5 times already, but he's a nice, convenient card to compare things to. Tyrion's a taunt. He has Divine Shield. He forces action through him. He's also an 8 mana 6/6. But sometimes he's that last resort taunt that saves you, and then you get the weapon back, and that's really quick too, because you can use it the very next turn. Marin the Fox, on the other hand, can just be ignored. And Marin the Fox does not himself kill the 0/8 treasure chest, and he doesn't even kill it with pings. It's really important that that chest has 8 health instead of 6 or 7, which would make it a lot more likely that you had a resource on board to easily kill that treasure chest. So that's a little bit tough to work with too. Now, obviously, a lot of decks do have ways to kill 0/8s without too many problems, I should say. And of course, there are cards like Crazed Alchemist, which make killing a 0/8 really, really easy. And of course, there are cards like Potion of Madness and Divine Spirit and Inner Fire that can leverage a 0/8 minion on your opponent's side of the board really nicely as well. So I think for most classes, Marin the Fox is still going to be just too slow. Despite the swing potential of all 4 of these cards and how ridiculous they are, I think it'll just be too risky to commit this much mana to a card that's not immediately impacting the game or helping you win. It's really value-oriented and it's slow most of the time. So most classes won't be able to utilize this, but there will certainly be a handful that find ways to make this work, whether that's comboing with the 0/8, whether that's running some cards that make sense for them, like Crazed Alchemist, for instance. There will be certain metas, too, if they slow down, that support Marin the Fox. So I do think this card will see some play. There are enough greedy, late-game value kinds of decks that work really well with this sort of card. They're just not that commonplace. So it's just going to take the right deck and the right environment to fit Marin the Fox. But I do think, despite the fact that most classes will have to avoid this one, it is still, in fact, a playable card. So now let's move on to a legendary weapon, which, first off, we've never seen a collectible legendary weapon before. We've seen some legendary weapons that come off other minions like Atiesh and Ashbringer from Tyrion. Wow, that guy showed up a lot. But this is a collectible legendary weapon, the very first one. And not only that, but this goes to Priest. This is a Priest card. So classes that have never before had weapons suddenly now have access to weapons in their collection. This is the Dragon Soul, pretty famous item from Warcraft lore. And it's a 3-mana weapon for Priest. It has no attack value and 3 durability, neither of which are seemingly very relevant because you can't attack with a weapon anyway, so it's not burning durability. But it does have an effect, so when this thing is equipped, anytime you cast 3 spells in a single turn, it just automatically summons you a 5/5 dragon. And it was confirmed if you cast 6 spells in a single turn, it will, guess what, summon you 2 5/5 dragons. So this is sort of a commitment to mana that's really slow and really conditional. In other words, the 3 mana you spend right away is almost impossible to use on turn 3. It's harder to use later in the game too because it's just not that easy to cast 3 spells in a single turn. Of course it happens. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It's just, it takes commitment and it takes a deck list to do that sort of thing. Because Priest does have cheap spells, silences, power word shield. It's going to happen. Not saying it won't happen, just that you have to build your deck and you have to play in a certain way to fulfill that. And even then, it's not something that's going to happen every turn, of course. It's only going to happen certain turns. So I think most of the time you end up spending 3 mana to sort of bank some value later in the game where you might summon a couple extra 5/5s. You might summon 2 to 3 extra 5/5s in a given game, but it's usually going to be a handful of turns later. So the question becomes, can Priest afford to commit 3 mana to a card that doesn't really pay dividends until down the road? And even when it pays those dividends, are those dividends, in other words, the 5/5 dragons, are they valuable enough for that to make sense? And those are a lot of questions to answer. On top of all that, of course, we also have to talk about weapon removal and how a card like this is really susceptible to the acidic swamp oozes and the gluttonous oozes of the world. So weapon removal becomes more powerful. Not only that, of course, every class is going to be getting a legendary weapon, and we'll see one more in this video, in fact. So weapon removal seems like it's going to be more prominent than ever. So a lot of risk, it feels like to me, with this card. A tempo risk, a straight up just opportunity cost risk with oozes out there in the meta. But if it works, and if you build your deck, if you run those cheap silences, some power word shields, potion of madnesses, and you get 3 or 4 5/5s, that's a nice rate of return on only 3 mana. Getting a 15/15 or a 20/20 off your Dragon Soul is really, really nice. And with things like Shadow Visions and Lyra, there are certainly cards that do synergize with this. So I think Priest will potentially find ways to run Dragon Soul. I don't know if it's going to be an all-star card. I don't think it's going to be run by every list by any means. But I think there could be some decks that do make this one work as just a banked value piece. Because there are a lot of times where Priest just kind of passes turns or doesn't have anything to do anyway. So why not run a card like Dragon Soul just because it's kind of a freebie and gives you some value later that could help you win a game. So it's nice, too, that it's just sort of infinite. It just sits there forever, so there are always opportunities to use it. You know, any point in the game moving forward, as long as it hasn't been removed, it's got that opportunity to pass back some value your way, which is really nice. But I do think when you compare this to something like Atiesh, it's considerably worse than Atiesh, but of course much cheaper, more flexible. So who knows? Maybe it's good enough. I have a little bit of faith in this card for actually seeing some play. But now let's move on to the next legendary weapon, and this is the Mage legendary weapon. Another class that has never before seen a weapon. Also a 0/3. This time, though, it does have a 6 mana cost. This is Aluneth, and for this one it says at the end of your turn, draw 3 cards. Now, when I said that the previous weapon was slow, I think this one is just dreadfully slow and way too slow and frankly a little bit risky in its effect. So imagine committing 6 mana and basically every turn for the rest of the game you're gonna draw 3 cards unless the weapon gets removed, right? That's a lot of cards to keep loading up into your hand every turn, and most decks would not be able to support that. Of course, they would just not be able to spend or play cards fast enough or spend mana fast enough to empty their hand to keep up with this, and they'd eventually just start burning cards. You even see that sometimes in Shaman with like double mana Tide Totem on the board. They're like, crap, I gotta burn some cards. I can't handle this. This is just too much. Aluneth is gonna have that same problem in a lot of cases. So I think the way to support this card is to build like a kind of super fast mage deck that has a lot of burn spells and like cheap aggressive minions or whatever. And then Aluneth is sort of that top end card that you just run in your deck. It's almost like a Divine Favor or a Genzo in a way that once you burn your hand, you hope you top deck Aluneth, and then it just refills you and it gives you a couple Fireballs and Frostbolts and Pyroblasts and Firelands Portals every turn, etc., so that you can like dig out a win where you otherwise couldn't find one. But I still think it's too slow for that kind of deck. At 6 mana, that's just a long time away in an aggro deck. Like, even on turn 6, like most of the time the opponent is starting to stabilize around that point. They're healing up, they're returning lethals because they've built a board and they're starting to just push you over. So, you know, you might get 1 or 2 turns out of Aluneth, and is that enough going into 7 or 8 mana to win you a game? I don't know. But if you look at this in a more controlled deck, I definitely don't think it works. 3 cards is too many to draw, puts you at fatigue risks. There's all kinds of issues on that side of it. And of course, just committing 6 mana and not getting anything immediately, that's really, really slow. You're just passing a turn, basically, for 6 mana, doing nothing else. There might be some times where you could play, like, Frost Nova Aluneth and do something cool there, but that's still really late in the game, and this has been a dead card in your hand the entire game up to that point. So this one, to me, just it feels too singular in its direction and its design. If this was like a 4-mana card that drew you 2 cards every turn, I think it'd be way, way stronger. But right now, it's kind of bridging the gap between a late-game card, but probably be better in an aggressive deck, I think. So I don't really see where this one fits. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's some deck out there that can take advantage of this, because, of course, that much card draw is very powerful. I don't mean to deny that. Like, getting cards is great. And getting cards every turn is even better, but I just don't see where this one lives or where this one fits. So I'm having trouble ever finding a place where this one actually gets played in Hearthstone as we understand it today. And that's why, to me, Aluneth looks on the weaker side of cards I've seen so far in this expansion. So now let's move on to another incredibly slow card, but this time of the minion variety. This is Warlock's new legendary minion, Rin the First Disciple, a 6-mana 3/6 taunt, so a little understated for its cost, but the taunt is nice and defensive, so it's not like the riskiest card to commit 6 mana to. It does have some defensive utility, but it's really the Death Rattle that makes this one interesting, and that Death Rattle says add the first seal to your hand. So let me try to explain exactly how this works, because Blizzard didn't provide a ton of great clear artwork to showcase all of these different cards, but essentially the first seal, which you can't see here, which is hidden behind the other 4 seals, summons you a 2/2 demon, and then it adds the second seal to your hand. The second seal summons you a 3/3 demon and adds the third seal to your hand, etc., 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 all the way up until the final seal. All of these are 5-mana spells, by the way. That finally summons you a 6/6 demon and adds Azari the Devourer to your hand. And as you can see there, Azari the Devourer is a 10-mana 10/10 with a battle cry, destroy your opponent's deck. That's right, their entire deck suddenly goes up in flames. Now that does not mean their hand, as Blizzard showcased in the video, only the cards in their deck, not their hand. So here's the deal with Rin, as far as I'm concerned. I think this card is just incredibly slow. Yes, it has a super fun effect. Yes, it's really well designed. It's fantastic in its execution from a theme standpoint, but I just don't ever see how this is playable. You're sacrificing a little bit when you play Rin. The first few seals are terribly inefficient. Getting 2/2s and 3/3s and even 4/4s for 5 mana feels really, really bad, and that just gives your opponent all the time in the world to execute their game plans, to draw their combos, to cement the board. You're committing so much mana that you don't have any reserves left to really do anything else with your turns except maybe that occasional Hellfire. But even if you drop Rin on turn 6, think about it, like on turn 7 you have 2 spare mana, on turn 8 you'd have 3 spare mana, and it takes a lot of commitment to get to the final seal, and many, many turns to get to the final seal. And then even when you do, you finally have to commit 10 mana to a 10/10 that doesn't have taunt, that doesn't clear your opponent's board, that doesn't remove their resources in hand. All it does is actually kill their deck. And I mean, honestly, by the time you play all these cards, you got to spend 41 mana. Did I do that math right? 25 for the seals, 6 for Rin, and 10 for Azari. 41 mana commitment. You finally get to destroy your opponent's deck. But I think there's a really, really good chance by that point you'll have lost the game already anyway, or at least put yourself in a losing position or so far behind that it doesn't really matter if their deck is destroyed. So I think this is one of those 4 fun cards, trap cards. It's going to be really hard to build around. I know there are some mill warlock kinds of things out there with cards like Gnome Ferradu, and this might fit into that theme, but I just don't see it working. I think there are probably better ways to play that kind of fatigue style. We already have a lot of slow, expensive cards that are good at outlasting your opponent, like Jiraxis and even Blood Reaver Gul'dan, and I don't see Rin as a necessary part of those decks. The removal is more important. Those swingy style cards are more important. And Azari the Devourer is just too slow and doesn't accomplish much towards that end. So unfortunately for me, Rin, the First Disciple, is probably going to be another one of those Warlock legendaries, at least on the minion side of things, that just don't see very much play. So now that we're through the legendary cards that were revealed in the set so far, let's move through these next ones a little bit quicker. Up first, we have a new Paladin Minion, one of the many Kobolds that are apparently going to be appearing in the set, as the name would suggest. This is the Drygulch Jailor, a 2-mana 1/1 with a Death Rattle. Add 3 Silverhand Recruits to your hand. And I'm sorry, I just don't like Drygulch Jailor very much. First off, of course, a 1/1 for 2. That's understated. It's not very aggressive or strong for a 2-drop. And the Death Rattle here is also fairly slow, because guess what? When Silverhand Recruits are added to your hand, you still have to play those Silverhand Recruits. So you're committing additional mana and opportunity on future turns. Now, I think the idea behind this card is maybe one last attempt to make hand buff more valuable, because of course if you're putting multiple minions into your hand, and in fact they're cheap minions, then probably the hand buff hits more targets, and therefore each of those hand buff cards becomes a little bit more valuable. But even then, you know, just hitting a few Silverhand Recruits for +1/+1 or even +2/+2 just isn't that strong in the scheme of fast Hearthstone starts. That's nothing compared to what you can do with Murlocs, because when it happens in your hand, instead of happening on board, that ends up just being a really, really slow kind of play. It doesn't impact the board soon enough. I found a lot more success with hand buff cards when you're hand buffing taunts or Divine Shield minions, so that you can utilize those stats in more active ways and force your opponent to operate through those stats. Whereas with something like this, it just still dies to AoEs. Your opponents can still just ignore those minions as they hit you in the face. So Drygulch Jailor, to me, maybe has some Death Rattle synergies that are interesting with some other cards that are coming in the set. Who knows the potential there? I don't really think it's going to be good even then, though. And as a card by itself, I just don't see seeing it fitting into the Paladin game plan very well either. So Drygulch Jailor looks like a fairly weak card to me. So up next we have another Kobold. This time it's a rogue minion, the Kobold Illusionist, a 4-mana 3/3, and in a lot of ways a very similar card to the previous one, because it also has a Death Rattle that involves a 1/1. But I like Kobold Illusionist a lot more as a card, because I think it has the potential for higher utility and all kinds of shenanigans. So I think there are certain kinds of decks that will find a way to make this card really, really powerful. Because first things first, it's actually summoning a minion onto the board as opposed to adding minions into your hand. So it's a more consistent on-board tempo kind of card. You're getting 4/4 in total stats most of the time when you play Kobold Illusionist. And of course, also, that 1/1 that you summon can do other things. It can be a Death Rattle minion. You could summon a 1/1 Cairn Bloodhoof and then get a free 4/5 out of your Kobold Illusionist. That's really fantastic. So in a lot of the ways, you can think of this as almost a Barnes-style card. A little bit slower than Barnes, but also has Death Rattle synergies, which Rogue does have a handful of different ways to utilize historically. So there's also things like Malagos that can be pulled off Kobold Illusionist, and sometimes you can even control when and how that happens, because of course you can choose when to activate Death Rattles if this minion stays alive on board. So there are interesting things with maybe stealth and how this card operates. So I see potential for this card in a lot of ways, in just a Death Rattle value style deck and a combo Malagos kind of home it could work. It's just much, much better than the previous card for a variety of reasons, a sort of pseudo Barnes replacement for Rogue, or just an additional Barnes for Rogue. That's pretty cool, and I like this idea of 1/1 minions. So I definitely think Kobold Illusionist will see some play. I think it's a good fit for what game plans Rogues typically try to utilize, and I expect we'll see this card quite a bit. So up next, let's move on to a new spell for Warrior. This is Gather Your Party, and it introduces a new keyword for Hearthstone, which is Recruit. And Recruit means pulling a minion from your deck and immediately putting it into play. So when you cast Gather Your Party, this spell will summon a random minion from your deck, it will take it out of your deck, and it will just put it into play. So if you only have Yashiraj in your deck, you cast Gather Your Party, it will summon your Yashiraj. Now that wouldn't be very good if you only had Yashiraj, because there'd be nothing for Yashiraj to summon, of course. But if you had Ysera, for instance, you could get a 6-mana Ysera. And hey, that's not so bad. But the real problem for me with Gather Your Party is that it's not a copy of a minion. We've seen a similar card already in Priest with Shadow Essence, right? And that summons a 5/5 copy of a minion from your deck. So this means that really most of the time, the max sort of mana discount you can get off Gather Your Party is 4 mana. If you summon a 10 mana minion, you're only really ever getting a 4 mana discount on that card, which, don't get me wrong, a 6 mana Ysera, fantastic, right? That's a really, really good card. But it's not game winning enough, I think, compared to the other kinds of shenanigans we see with things like Big Priest or Big Druid, where they can just utilize their mana in such ridiculous ways to get really, really cost-efficient kinds of cards. So, you know, getting that 6-mana Lich King, I don't know how good that actually is. It's just a slight discount. Now, of course, it does help you filter through your deck a little bit, which is an interesting side effect. You can pull minions out more consistently to draw into other sorts of things you might be looking for. It also just gives you some reliability on finding specific minions if you do run those and build your decks in certain ways. So, of course, there could be some combo potential or really specific deck structure that utilizes this card in a fantastic way to make it really, really powerful. And occasionally you will just pull that Yashiraj, which summons you your Ysera on turn 6, and that could be really, really good. So maybe Big Warrior is possible. I don't really think it's as strong as the other kinds of big decks we've seen so far, though. Now, there are going to be other Recruit-style cards revealed in the expansion, a couple of which we've already seen, that have conditions on the Recruit, so like recruit a minion for 4 or less mana. This one is totally open-ended, though, so who knows what could be built around this, but I don't see very much potential for building anything too oppressive or too overpowered with Gather Your Party. This just feels like a way to cheat out a few mana, which is not, at the end of the day, a game-winning or deck-defining kind of thing to me. So I think Gather Your Party's okay, but by no means incredibly strong or overpowered or as good as some of the other alternatives out there. And then finally I have one last card. This is Hunter's Crushing Walls, a new 7-mana spell. And it reads, destroy your opponent's left and rightmost minions. So if they have 5 minions on the board, it'll kill the thing on the left, and it'll kill the thing on the right. If they only have 2 minions on the board, presumably it will kill just both of the minions. So it's sort of a deadly shot for 2 minions in that way. And I think that's interesting. I think it's going to be best when there are 2 minions on the board. The real problem with Crushing Walls to me is that it does have a lot of play around issues. Like if your opponent knows that Crushing Walls is in the meta, and that's a card that your deck is potentially going to run, then they can just position their minions in a way that really punishes Crushing Walls, right? Like just put the small stuff on the outside, sort of the reverse meteor. So the fact that this is in a class that has no other sort of great positional disadvantages that are typically run, like Explosive Shot, for instance, you can probably predict pretty well how to play your minions. Now, of course, that said, if a hunter were to run both Crushing Walls and Explosive Shot, suddenly things get a little more intriguing because you could punish either direction. Like if they put the big thing in the middle and the small stuff on the outside, they're playing into Explosive Shot. If they do it the other way around, put the big stuff on the outside and the little thing in the middle, they're playing into Crushing Walls. So if there were some Control Hunter deck that managed to run all of these positional-based removal spells, maybe Crushing Walls could be okay. Most of the time, though, I think this card is just a little too predictable. And at the end of the day, just destroying 2 things for 7 mana isn't really that swingy or powerful of a card. The great thing about Deadly Shot for Hunter is that it can be a huge tempo swing. When your opponent plays that Lich King kind of card, you just Deadly Shot it. You've killed their giant single big threat for 3 mana. Crushing Walls doesn't feel like it has the same swingy kind of potential to me, because if you're spending 7 mana, you just don't have that much mana left to accomplish much else. And there's just not that many board states that are going to support Crushing Walls making a really powerful, swingy kind of removal style play. So this one just feels situational and conditional in a lot of punishing ways, and I don't think you're ever going to see metas or board states or even really a Hunter deck that supports this kind of card. I think it's cool that it exists, and something like Arena, for instance, Crushing Walls could be fantastic. It's just great removal for Arena when there are often just 2 or 3 minions out there that makes this better. And I like this kind of design, for the record. I think it's great to have positional punishments to make people think more and play around certain kinds of cards. So I'm glad it exists. I appreciate Blizzard creating these kinds of cards, but I don't think this is one we will see in Constructed very often. And there you go, guys. That was it for my detailed portion of the reviews. I felt like I had a lot to say, particularly about those first couple legendaries in this set. There's some interesting new mechanics, some crazy new cards and effects, a neat new theme. This is going to be a fun expansion. I can tell Blizzard has really already shown their willingness to do some cool stuff, like many of the past expansions. So I'm excited to see where all of this goes in the future. So now what I'd like to do is move through these cards real quickly, rating them each from 1 to 5 stars for my quick reviews. Up first, I think Marin the Fox is a 3-star card. I think Dragon Soul is a 3-star card. I think Aluneth is a 1-star card. I think Rin the First Disciple is a 2-star card. I think Drygulch Jailor is a 1-star card. I think Kobold Illusionist is a 4-star card. I think Gather Your Party is a 2-star card. And I think Crushing Walls is a 2-star card. So that's it, guys. That wraps up part 1 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review. I've already got, I think, 6 new cards to review for part 2 coming very, very soon. But until then, I'm really curious, what do you guys think about these cards? What do you think about the theme? Are these going to be any good? Are the legendary weapons awesome? Are they going to be a failure? Are you excited to see them? Do you wish Blizzard did more? Do you wish they had attack? I want to hear all of your thoughts, of course. Tell me why I'm right. Tell me why I'm wrong. I want your insights on each of these cards and why they're going to be amazing or why they're going to be failures. I can't wait to hear your opinion because I really do value what you guys have to say. I know I get things wrong from time to time. Occasionally I get things right, but I always want to hear your side of things. So until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.